happy to be here because for us it means a lot that there's interest in our little tiny country. Tiny. Okay, so I think we have to start by an overview of the Mexican territory for the people that actually don't know where it is. You can see it straight on a map, but why it's important? It's because of the population. Numbers and population in Mexico is very determinant. They determine a lot of the decisions that are taken by bookers, by tour managers, and by streamers and stuff like that. So there are 32 federative entities, and it's the 11th most populous country in the world, a little over 119 million. These are the cities with the most population. State of Mexico and Mexico City become some sort of amalgam of Mexico City, which means that a lot of people from the state of Mexico go to Mexico City for shows. So you're talking about 17 million and then 8 million people. Veracruz and Jalisco are next ones. Puebla is becoming one of the most important concert cities for Mexico also. And then you have Nuevo León, which is part of Monterrey. So, and Jalisco, which is part of Guadalajara, which are our main cities for touring, especially foreign bands. So that's kind of like, of course, bands go to the States with most people. So some key facts I would like to have. This, by the way, this keynote, you guys can have it. I'm sure they're going to upload it somewhere where you can have it. So I'm going to just go through it and talk about it in a very, not quick way, but if you need this info, I'm sure they'll give it to you. So the current situation, Mexico has the biggest music industry market in Latin America. Obviously, it's the second in an income for recorded music from Brazil. Brazil is huge. It has its own world, it has its own language, but Mexico is obviously not within the type of negotiations of context as Brazil, so it's considered something completely different. In the music market, according to PwC, the country is expected to continue being a leader in the region, producing 316 million for 2019 in live music and 460 million for the entire music market in 2019. This study was from last year, so I'm sure we're getting there. And the streaming, also according to PwC, is predicted that by the year 2020, the streaming market in Mexico will be worth 128 million. Why is this important? Because streaming in Mexico is big. I'll get there. Okay, so I really want to tell you really quickly a story about why Mexico is the way it is. 1920s is the Bolero beginnings, which means for us is the post-revolutionary era, where we're starting to create the little snippets of sound that are Mexican or become Mexican. We're really influenced in Latin America with Cuba. We're really interested in stuff that's going on in Argentina. We do tango, we do all of the danzón. And we start working on our own sound. And then we transition into the golden age of Mexican music. This, till today, is really important because in 1950s, we start creating our own folklore idea. And we have music, we have films, we have actors, we have musicians, and we start creating this context of being very creative in the music scene, which obviously made Mexico become the biggest import of music from then and since then. And then we have a weird time, which means we're about to have the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City. And the problem was that the government from that time created, I don't know, is any of you aware of what happened with student marches in 1968? What happened was that there was it's a very complicated story and it's very interesting. I invite you to read about it. But what happened was that there was a corruption within a big march of students in Mexico City at the same time that the Olympics were going to happen. So the government tried to turn it off in a very violent way. A lot of people lost their lives. And that started a really black period for youth in Mexico. Not just the people in Mexico, but for youth. So at the same time, we had our biggest music festival, which is called the Mexican Woodstock which is Avándaro. And what happened was that it was 200,000 people, and it was the same mayhem as Woodstock. It was emergency, it was crisis, but everyone was having a really, 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 really good time. So, unfortunately, it created a mayhem that it was very delicate for police in that context and in that time, where the youth wasn't seen as some sort of creative, outpouring, interesting crowd. It was actually very dangerous to be part of the youth and part of the creative youth in Mexico. So in 1970s, rock actually was banned in Mexico as well as massive events. So what happened is that Luis Echeverria, which was the president after Tlatelolco's student problem, banned bands from recording rock music in labels. And also, they banned rock music in the radio stations. So it was a weird time in which the young people that had actually started finding their own voice, which is my father's generation, created some things that were called funky holes. A funky hole is a place where you fit 150 people, you don't check the sound, obviously, because you don't have money, and you take a band and they play there. And apparently this started a very interesting entrepreneur mindset in Mexico about if we don't get big international acts, we're going to make our little shows. So you didn't have concerts at this time, but which meant that the youth started to look for little spaces where they could, it was theaters, it was houses. The sound was terrible. There was no PA at all. There was no stage, but they had a good time. So funky holes actually, for me and for my generation, which is the generation that started to recreate, or not even recreate, to give hope to the new music live scene, it's some sort of a way in which I am giving back my dad's authority for music. Which I mean is that I feel as if I'm giving back to the generation that lost this part. So that is very interesting because there's a lot of people around my age that it's kind of like the second wave of music production, creation, touring, etc. that comes from the children of this generation. So I think that is why it's very important for me to tell you this story, because the way we operate is very nuanced, in a very new way, in a way where we weren't taught by anyone. We just figured it out, just like they figured out their own funky holes. It's a great story, actually, if you just want to Google it. And then, late 80s, we were rescued by, well, no, first I have to tell one story. Rod Stewart went to Querétaro, which is a town that is kind of like 2 hours and a half away from Mexico City. González Iñárritu, the film director, used to work at a radio station, and he said in the radio while he was a DJ host that this show, this Rod Stewart show, was made because they were testing the people to see if it was safe to bring concerts back to Mexico. It wasn't safe. Rod Stewart had to be driven on an ambulance just to get in and out, but it meant that we were ready. We were ready for a show. And then 2 years after that, in 1971, Ocesa saved us, and they made the first In Excess show in Palacio de los Deportes, which I find a very interesting circle because Palacio de los Deportes was a venue that was made specially for the 1968 Olympics. So having a show in a venue that was made for the Olympics that wrongly treated students, for me, it was a success. And it's a great part of Mexican music story. Then, of course, now this year, we have an average, there are 2 international artist shows in Mexico City per week. So, of course, all of this had to happen for us to have that, okay? So, now, how do Mexicans consume music? I am getting very freaked out by this. I am very sorry. There we go. Monitor Latino, which is our monitoring agency. We don't have a lot of monitoring agencies, and I know when I do reports for the artists, I'm looking for spots in radio. We don't have as many reports as the US might have, or we don't have stats on online radio or university radio. But our biggest one is Monitor Latino. And according to them, in radio, again, very important, the biggest genres are national, which means banda, norteño, ranchero, grupero, sierreño, and duranguense, which is not normally what you would hear outside of Mexico City. Why is this important? These are the numbers of households equipped with a radio in Mexico. Radio is still important for some very large population in Mexico's territory. However, even with these numbers, the independent scene or the pop scene is huge. So it's very important not to take this information as a whole, which what we were saying earlier is that this is just a guideline for understanding what's going on radio. Right now, there are 19 million radios in households. This is important also because promotion in radio is very difficult in Mexico. I get to there. But this is just kind of like to make you understand that the population is so big that this doesn't even matter. Okay? And the devices used for listening to the radio in Mexico in 2017, home sound system. Okay? This is a crowd completely different to what probably is your crowd, which is more of a streaming crowd, which is more of an arts crowd, a culture crowd. And then you have to understand also how they consume music, which is what I'm going to do next. Okay, radio in Mexico. There are 3 types. Why this is important specifically is because I get this question a lot whenever I'm starting a marketing press strategy for any band. So there are 3 types of ways in which you can separate radio in Mexico. The first one is top 40 stations, which are the stations that play top 40 artists, and they have the best relationships with major labels and work with a promotion system, which I don't want to say involves money, but it does. Sorry. So most of the top 40 stations do have a commercial agreement with major labels. So it's really difficult to plug an indie band or world music band in a top 40 station. So we have the other 2, which means that we have independent or government funded. They can't involve money at all. Like they can't have money places where you, sorry, I forgot the name, fundraisers, or they can't have sponsorships. They can't involve money, so genre choices are more open. We recently had a problem where I'm not gonna go into politics because it's shitty everywhere. So in Mexico, it's like the worst right now. And the problem was that our government right now is doing some sort of, how do you say it in Spanish? Saving money? Cutting back budget for everything that doesn't involve, everything that involves culture or music, they're making the budget smaller. What this did is that it canceled one of our biggest radio stations in Mexico City for rock, which is Reactor 105.7, which still was, we were able to still plug artists there. We had a great relationship, and it was one of our greatest radio stations at some point, and still is very respected. So he cut budget from one day to another. And 1 week before, we lost RMX, which was another great indie radio station. So in the same week, we lost our 2 main radio stations. And this created havoc in Mexico, and social media went insane. We felt as if they were taking like our youth in some way. So the crowd in Mexico is so big that we managed to bring back one of them, and it was a government-funded one. So we were really proud about that. And it's changing, it's doing some really cool stuff. So that's how kind of like the scene of the Mexican radio is going on. And online and podcasts, we have great platforms for new artists. However, the audience is very limited. We haven't found the importance of online radio in Mexico. There are some small radio stations that have, online stations that have been started by old school hosts, and that's how they seem to pull audiences and pull people, but otherwise it's very new. However, podcasts are doing really well. So it's just a matter of figuring out what the best path to things might be. Okay, and then we get to why we're the cool kids in town. We predicted that by the year, we already saw these numbers, but I just wanted to make sure that you knew. Mexico City has the most listeners on Spotify globally. I have a joke, and I have to share it, that I want to make a t-shirt that says my band's top city is Mexico City, and just give it away to everyone. Mexico City will be part of your Spotify, which is great. It's a great thing, but that doesn't have to be the only key point on your transition to Mexico. There are a lot more, and having the top city, of course, is great. However, don't take it as the only thing. Whenever you want to approach Mexico City, just make sure there's some other things, which we'll talk about, obviously, right now. So we're going to see some numbers right now. We found out that 97% of Mexican internet users has used YouTube to listen to music. Very important. Mexico also is the biggest consumer of music through YouTube. Why is this? A lot of places in Mexico City market like small, not venues, small stores, some vendors on the street, and a lot of the, not poor, but the population that aren't able to afford probably someone to make a playlist for their business. They just push play on playlist in YouTube, not even Spotify. Okay? So that's why we have those numbers. Okay, live market. Of course, I have the guru of live market here. I don't want to get into it so much because I'd be afraid of sitting next to him on a plane for like 9 hours if I say something wrong. But Mexico is one of the most important tour highlights for an artist. Its population and loyalty makes it a mandatory stop for anyone. It is. However, there's something that is very important, and I'm sure we'll talk about it later, is the rate difference. Yes, Mexico is very cheap, but it's very, the difference from pesos and dollars is so high that some artists' fees are very difficult to cover. So it's just a matter of understanding how much a peso is really valued for. And if you really want to go to Mexico and don't have the expectations of a big check, that's the greatest thing for everyone. Because otherwise you do have to kind of like change fees in order to be in Mexico. Just because we're unable to afford it because the difference for dollars is really big. Okay, so I'm going to go through highlights real quick. The highest percentage of the income generated by the music industry comes from live shows. Mexico is the home of two of the biggest companies in the world, Ocesa and Signia. They used to compete with Live Nation. Very important. I think this is key. Now Live Nation is in alliance with Ocesa. So you have, I think, the two most powerful producing producing companies, and then you put them together, and then it's going to be a very exciting 2020 for us. Okay? And then, according to PwC, the success of both production companies is not only due to a high level of investment, very important, but it's also motivated by the growth of the middle class, who is willing to invest its money in entertainment experiences. The last 10 years have been very important for the growth of the interest for shows. The more festivals that happen in Mexico, the more people they get to fill with. We just had a festival that changed venue because it was a festival that was actually small for the venue that it had, so it changed into a bigger venue. So that's kind of like a little bit of how it's going on. Am I right? Am I here with Live Market? Okay. In Mexico, 60% of music events is run by Ocesa Entretenimiento, which is also very interesting and important to know. Festivals. This is just a snippet again. Music festivals in Mexico are celebrated mainly in the center and north of the country, mainly. This is being changed actually by Ocesa, and they are actually starting to create a festival culture within the entire territory, which is a very awesome thing, I might add. And then we do massive concerts: Rolling Stones, Paul McCartney, Roger Waters, Coldplay, Snoop Dogg, Arctic Monkeys. And then our biggest festivals actually are Corona Capital and Vive Latino. Corona Capital is just Anglo bands, only English speaking, and Vive Latino has a mixture of everything, being Vive Latino actually our biggest, both by Ocesa. Our crowded events with lineups from the most popular headliners in the world, and many of them are handled by Ocesa or Signia. Here's the important part. Although there are more and more independent spaces, because there's a very important presence of Signia and Ocesa in Mexico, mostly Ocesa, many smaller acts and smaller artists tend to go to independent bookers, which is not a bad thing. However, there's an opportunity. It doesn't only have to be Ocesa and Signia. Also, depending on the size of the project, of course, you only want to go with them because they are trustworthy. Everything will be fine. You are not in like shaky territory. However, and this is where I'm gonna go, I think next. Yes. However, new markets and new businesses come with new problems that you guys haven't dealt with in 20 years. We're starting to deal with them. Okay, so I'm gonna go now into the market characteristics, kind of like stories and jokes about what's been going right and wrong about Mexico for the last, I guess, 15 to 10 years. So there are many characteristics that are attributed to the Mexican business side. Some of them are true, some of them are not true. I'm here to tell you what it is and what isn't. Not true. Mexico is a lazy country. We're not lazy. We just have a lot of heat. So that slows down like processes. But they happen, believe me. So Mexico is unsafe? No. Well, yes. It's unsafe as any country. Please don't see Narcos and think that's how we live, because we don't. I mean, we do, but we don't. We go to certain places that are there, and we know people that might know people, but no, it's not like that. So what it means is that your band can go to Mexico and there won't be a problem. I'm sure that all the people that have gone to the trade trips can assure that Mexico is safe. Thank you. I was very nervous about that one. So yeah, taking a band to Mexico is very safe. Of course, dealing with the people that you have to deal with, you have to make sure that they are trustworthy and you're dealing with professional people. I will go there in a second. You should never trust an independent Mexican promoter. Not true. Some of them are one of the most talented type of people that I've ever encountered, and actually a lot of independent promoters are now allied. Well, they became bigger and now are allied with Ocesa and Signia. True, Mexico is cheap. However, this is a problem. As I mentioned before, it's really cheap to go to Mexico, but we might not have the means to pay an entire fee that it is asked for us. I know that some bands have kind of like twisted stuff and have been able to go to Mexico, like lowering their fee, but this is something that many independent people might want to understand and consider. It's important to have an established and reliable network. Okay. Since we're really new in this whole new making a scene and having a Mexican scene, there's a lot of things that we really want to trust. There's a lot of things that you really want to trust in a Mexican market, which means that you have to find a network of people that work for you. There's, after Ocesa and Signia, there is not many businesses that only handle booking or only handle press. There's either one person that is great at press and 3 people that are great at booking. So in Mexico, it's more about teamwork and networking and finding actually the people that you want to work with. It's not just one. It has to be a teamwork and it has to come from many sides. Follow-up is important. This is where the if we are lazy thing, no. Follow-up is important. Some businesses don't have the same work rhythm as the USA or Europe because of the lack of experience, okay? Some of us are actually kind of like slower paced because a lot are learning on the process. However, this doesn't mean that things will go wrong. Just very important for you guys to understand. Friendship is one of the most important foundations of business transactions. These questions, I think, will come up later, and we will have a good time talking about it. But yes, it's very important to trust your team and trust your network, and it's more of a keeping a friendship within your group, well, your network and your teammates in Mexico. Do not. What I best suggest is that, well, we'll get there, but I think what I best suggest is that you trust us, because what you might understand as pitching for radio, we understand it completely different. So it's a matter of trusting the team. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And the Mexican market tends to be very aggressive, and independent ventures have many ups and downs. So just be careful about who you trust, what you do, who you do it with. Always ask for references. If there's an artist similar to you or the artist you're working with that has gone to Mexico, ask them. It's a matter of see who people are working with and to see if it actually worked. Yeah. I'm sure it will work. You are all great, successful, and awesome people, I'm sure. Yeah. Potential partners. In order to navigate the Mexican market, it is important to have an established network before trying to break into it. Before getting to Mexico, build it up and create it before you get there. Why is CAC Madafaka an example here? So, I am sorry to everyone that went to the Nordic Trade visits to Mexico, because I used CAC Madafaka for every single example there, but I think you guys have to understand what's going on. CAC Madafaka went to Mexico City in 2013, I think, to a venue that's called Caradura, which is kind of like our CBGBs. It's 350 people capacity. They sold out 2 shows. From there, their team in Mexico, which is Abram, which is a very talented manager now, who actually reintroduced Erlend Oy and Kings of Convenience to Mexico. He created that relationship from there. And Kings of Convenience and Erlend Oy are one of the biggest bands in Mexico, actually. He made sure that CAC Madafaka came to Mexico as frequently as possible. So they've played both Caraduras, and then they've played like 5 festivals. They're playing Plaza Condesa, which is 1,500 people, 2,000 people capacity, and they're doing great on sale tickets. Why is this important? They keep coming back, and they keep coming back, and they keep doing shows outside of Mexico City. They have a relationship with their Mexican fans. They have their own Mexican merch. They have their own Mexican strategy. They have their own Mexican press. Somehow, during all of this, they're making sure that they make the people of Mexico special in their own career. It's not about we playing in Mexico. It's about we playing for you guys who sent us this fan art, who says they like us. They're very, very, very close to this relationship with their Mexican artist. And it's all about Mexicanizing your strategy, which means just be nice with us and send us some social media just for Mexicans and geotag stuff and talk in Spanish. It really, all of those little things really matter in strategies. And then, well, of course, that's one way, which is really interesting because it's just a matter of one person being the key person in their strategy in Mexico, which is Abram. And Abram takes care of everything else. They've noticed that if they trust Abram and they just trust him, Abram will make sure that he gets an entire team for them. And then another example is Nucci. Throughout the Swedish embassy in Mexico, the Swedish embassy in Mexico has had a very important discourse over the last couple of years about the the equality of of female and male representatives in electronic music. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to balance female artists in lineups where there mostly would be men. So they choose Mutec Festival, for example, that it's an electronic festival in Mexico City. And they choose to bring Swedish female electronic artists to the show. So it's not a promoter, it's not a booker, it's the Swedish embassy. So you have, if your project has same characteristics as that, the Swedish embassy in Mexico is a key place for you guys, because it has to do a lot with the support of new artists, and they not only support them on playing in Mexico, they also make sure that they know key people in Mexico. So Nucci with Oli, who is a great Mexican electronic artist, they got to go to kind of like a retreat outside of Mexico City to record 6 songs. But from there, Nucci and Oli met, and they started this relationship where they are now doing stuff by themselves without the help of the Swedish embassy. So it's kind of like a matter of looking where your solid pillars are and where you can add Mexican pillars. That's how I see it, because that's the way it's easier for everyone to understand what you guys need, which I'm sure it's just not a show. I'm sure for everyone, it's not just to go to Mexico, play a show, and come back. What you really want to do is create some sort of relationship with the Mexican audience and the relationship with your Mexican team to see how far away and how long that relationship can last. So, I mean, this is where the presentation and the keynote ends. So I just want to add that Mexico is one of the best crowds that you'll ever have, by the way. It's one of the greatest people that will help you work with whatever you need. We are very, as I mentioned before, we're more of a family-oriented country, which means that if we have a good relationship with someone, we're going to take care of it because it's valuable for both. So it's just a matter of looking what you want, intercepting what you think you might need, and actually asking instead of asking what's going on instead of asking what to do. That's kind of like the transition in which Mexicans are easier to target a team and to target a strategy. Okay? So that's the part of the keynote.
I have loads of questions. I was going to begin with why has Mexico become such a large market? It's happened in relatively few years. What has happened to make Mexico City Spotify's largest listening base?
Well, I think my understanding of it is that it has to do with how the consumption of music has evolved. You used to have either have a radio and listen to whatever the radio was playing, but now with the internet it's very, very democratic. So like people with a smartphone or a computer, which is basically like a really big part of the population, have access to any music they want at any time. And also like the boom of festivals around the world has also impacted Mexico in a very positive way. And we have now like 40 plus festivals every year, which really make what Malfi was saying earlier, that bands come to the country and bands play constantly year after year after year, and that has permeated and has had repercussions in the industry that like promote the consumption of music and promote the consumption of live music, which makes it a very, very healthy market.
Yeah. You work for OCESA, which is one of the main, who also are affiliated with Live Nation. Can you tell us a bit about OCESA and how you work?
Yeah, so OCESA is basically, it's a family company. It started out doing parties in the early 90s. And since the Rod Stewart show, it has brought like many international artists to the country. We now have several departments. I work in the international events, so I focus on bringing acts from different countries to Mexico. But there's also a very, very healthy local industry, like with local artists and Latin artists as well, like coming from Colombia and Argentina and Spain even. And we now like we promote over 200 shows. We do the Formula One race every year. The festivals that I mentioned, and there's also like a sports division. Um, so I mean that's that. The Live Nation partnership has been going on for years. Actually, we have collaborated with them in like the big world tours with U2, Madonna, Lady Gaga, One Direction. All those we have done in partnership with Live Nation. But just like this year, it was made public that Live Nation was going to acquire a percentage of Ocesa. But I think this is going to help, but not in a drastic way because it's been going on for a few years. So for us, it's now like it's business as usual. We still work with the same people, the same agents that we used to work with, and it. I mean, it's all part of a big, a global trend of Live Nation consolidation, which has been going on for a number of years. But this will definitely help, and we're still the last 2 years have been record breaking years, so it's a great sign of the market and that it's working. What we're doing is working.
When did the Rod Stewart concert was in '89? The NXS concert was in 91.
Yes.
Yeah, and how has the live scene evolved since then? Was it slow? Because it seems like it's all gone very fast in the last few years. Can you tell us?
Yeah, there was a very it's been growing steadily. There have been some years that the global economic situations don't help as much. It's also a very cyclical industry in which some years you have a lot of tours happening, some years are a little slower, and that tends to diminish, sales and the overall live industry environment. But yes, like the last 3 years have been like growing in ridiculous numbers, and I think that has to do with festivals. But the way festivals work in Mexico is that we depend and rely upon a lot of sponsors. So that helps us subsidize ticket prices in order to be able to, pay the bands but not charge as much to the public and break even at the door. That means that by selling tickets, we pay for all our expenses, marketing, production, and talent. And then the sponsorship money goes as part of the profit of the festival. And that's negative, but it also has helped to reach a lot of newer audiences that wouldn't have been able to afford a ticket for a festival if they had to like pay for the whole thing. It would be like too expensive for them to pay.
Which genres would you say are most successful in Mexico at the moment?
It's a very, since it's a very broad amount of people, I don't think that there's like an answer to that. I mean, we've actually read that rock right now is the biggest one. I forgot something that I wanted to add to this question. The biggest following in Mexico, or the following bands have a really tight-knit Mexican crowd that everyone gets excited when they come over, which shows you how not specific genres are. So the Hives, Peter, Bjorn, and John, Refuse, the Radio Department, Swedish House Mafia, Sabaton, The Sounds, Diablo Swing Orchestra, Meshuggah, and Little Dragon. So you have a little bit of everything. So I think that's also very, very valuable, because I think that you don't predispose yourself into thinking, oh, I'm not that genre, I may not be able to go. Because I think metal has, like, whenever someone comes over, they always ask about metal, and it's growing.
It is growing. I think there's not a predominant genre in Mexico that is overwhelmingly larger than the rest. It's a lot of niche genres, but the niche in Mexico is so big that it allows for like small industries within the industry to develop in very different ways. So it makes it, I don't know, there's the metal scene, for example, is completely different to the electronic scene in Mexico, and the way it behaves and the way the players behave in the market is a little different. So it's not the same way you would approach if you're a DJ or a electronic music producer. You would not approach Mexico the same way a metal band does. You have to navigate through that ecosystem.
Malfi, you mentioned that Kings of Convenience, the Norwegian band, and Erlend Øye are huge in Mexico right now. Can you tell us a bit of how that came to be?
I think it was kind of like a second wave of the first time rock was inserted into Mexico. I think it was the year 2006, where there weren't a lot of independent newcomers within the music business. So whenever the internet era started to grow and people started knowing each other a little bit more, even though they lived in different states, it was easier to make a show. And it was easier to listen to a band. So those two things really, really created this second wave of creating a music business for Mexico. So, well, and there's also the fact that the genre is very attractive to Mexico. It has something, I don't know, I really would love to know why.
it's the sound.
It's
the sound of the band really resonates with the Mexican audience.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of Swede artists also like share that. I think like bands like Little Dragon, the Cardigans, the Hives, they're all like really appealing for the Mexican audience, because it sort of like reminds them of I don't know, like UK and UK rock bands, like nostalgic. There's like a genetic nostalgia in the Mexican audience, which Erlend Øye and The Whitest Boy Alive and Kings of Convenience really touch on that.
But so how did they work? I mean, you said you've underlined that you need to build a team, you need to be established before you start working towards Mexico.
Yeah.
Do you know how Kings of Convenience worked, for example?
Yes. Kings of Convenience came to a show to Guadalajara, actually with Abram, as part of their tour. Abram was part of a band called Technicolor Fabrics, but he was also starting his own agency, booking, management, and it literally happened in a night, in an after party, after they went to his house to play. That's how it happened. It wasn't a keynote, it wasn't a business deal. They just went for drinks after the show. And they created some sort of family in Mexico. So, as I mentioned in the keynote, of course it's important to have business plans. Of course it's important to know what the final point of what you're doing. But it's really like that. It's really approaching someone that you've sensed is true, because I think in Mexico we're also able to, between us, trust whoever we suggest. So with Kings of Convenience, that's how it started. And then it permeated into CAC Madafaka. So it's just a matter of sticking with your guns and sticking with your same team to see how far along you can go. Because you're growing as a band as your team is growing with you. So the contacts that Abram had 10 years ago are not the same ones he has now. So it's a matter of evolving with your own team.
I mean, Mexico as a country and Mexico City as a city compared to Sweden is huge. How would you describe the music industry? Is it proportional to the size of the city, or is it quite small?
No, I think it's very proportional, especially with Spotify playlists and pitching.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe consumption is even like, it's not as proportionate, because we were looking at the music consumption numbers that the IFPI just put out, and there is like a, if you look at the per caps of the country, then you do see that behavior in consumption is different. You know, people in Mexico listen to music when they're in the office, when they're in their commute, when they're in the gym, and we saw that it's not the same way here. So
what I meant was the people working within the industry and record labels, promoters. Because when you talk, it seems like you all know each other. Like,
Yes.
how huge is the music industry as in terms, you know? Is that proportional?
It's just two of us.
Yes. We all have you here. Nice. We took all of you. No, but how? I mean, for international artists and also indie, if you're talking to English speaking artists.
In my case, I wouldn't be able to compare it to somewhere else because I'm very, very focused in how Mexico works. But I can tell you that it's very, very few players which you see all the time, and you share the same connections that other people in the industry share. So it's a big market, a small industry.
Yeah, we have to be very careful about who we date.
Yeah, it seems to be good to know this Abram person. If
Yeah.
you want to.
Yeah, there are key people, and of course, very important. Whenever you need any type of advice, just go to the guys from the music expert office from here, because they know everyone now, and they're able to guide you through who would be good to talk to in Mexico, which is great. It's great to have an office that can do that for you.
But also, that means that there's a little group of people that has a huge amount of power.
Yes.
How do you think about that? Or do you think about that?
No, like it's an interesting point. I think it's not a matter of like we're jealous in a way that we don't let people in. It's just a matter that the people who have been successful is because they're professionals and they know what they're doing. So if there's a new player that wants to like become a part of this environment, and if they're professional, they will be able to get in. Like there's no sort of like bad vibes of people trying to be protectionist.
There's a huge amount of power over what music is being played, is what I mean.
Spotify is king,
Yeah.
and YouTube is king.
Yeah, and it's a war of the worlds when trying to pitch Spotify playlists actually in Mexico, because I heard a number in a party where apparently Spotify gets 50,000 songs per Friday, something like that. Major, minor, English speaking, not English speaking, and then the tiny ones. So it's just a bloodbath. Literally, there's no way in which there's no key way. Like there's no process. You have to know who pitches, who is Carlos from Spotify, who is Michelle from Spotify. You kind of like, which is a good thing, because if you know one, you'll know everyone. So, as he said, to be in the music business, you have to have credibility, because there are so many of us, but at the same time, so few, that if something goes wrong, everyone will know. So that's a good thing.
But isn't it also a bad thing that if you need to know these people, and if you don't get to know them, you can't get in? Do you know what I mean?
It's true, but if the music is good and you reach out to your fans and they see an audience, they will reach out to you. I've seen that happen in many cases, and new independent artists are growing from that because Spotify notices when an artist is talking to the audience and the audience is paying attention and they're listening and they're streaming, and they will be the ones that reach out to the artists and help them.
So it seems like this is a field of opportunity right now for artists and smaller labels, of which I'm guessing there's a few in this audience. So if you'd like to give us another crash course, you started doing it, but also if you can go into more detail. If I'm an artist or a label who wants to get into the Mexican market, how do I do it?
I can tell you like a couple of things that I could come up with. The first one is you don't necessarily want to break Mexico. You can get into Mexico by working the UK and the United States, if you try to like promote yourself in those markets which aren't that like as far as Mexico, you can do that, and Mexico will pay attention. For example, if we're constantly, checking out the lineups of festivals in the UK and in the US to see what people are listening to. So that's one way. You don't have to go all the way to Mexico. You can start creating a buzz in Europe and the US. And also, another thing that I think it's a great idea is just like be brave and reach out to artists that are doing like similar things as you are, and have a dialogue and start creating a conversation, and maybe a collaboration can happen, and that's just another way to get in the country and getting your music heard by the local scene.
Yeah, I agree. I completely agree. And it has to do reaching out, talking to people, maybe making sure you are seen by your Latin following. If your city is number 3 in your top Spotify, mention it a hell of a lot. Use social media to kind of like understand how your Mexican audience is talking to you. Ask, like, if we were to go to Mexico, which venue would it be? And kind of like start that discourse. And sometimes it happens that many bands come over to Mexico for the first time and they use it as more of a networking thing, where they do play a small little show, maybe not for sales, but they start meeting key people there. So it's just a matter of asking. You guys have a great broad range of musicians that I'm sure will fit in Mexico. So it's just a matter of making sure where other steps have been taken just to follow through.
You mentioned in your keynote that building friendships is important,
yes,
and that has to do with culture. Can
yes,
you explain more what you meant and how to do it?
Yeah, I think we've talked about it in different types of ways in which the more approachable you are towards your negotiations, and the more curious you are about processes, and the most trustworthy you are to the people that you work with, the more fluent the relationship will become. But that doesn't mean I say it in a convenience type of way. I say it in a quick type of way. That there are tips and tricks. Like, for example, for us, it's easier to reach us in WhatsApp than on email. So if you want to talk to your Mexican booker, you have to download WhatsApp. And you know that those tiny little things are the things that will create. But you won't know about that unless you have this trust relationship as a friendship. And as Mexicans, we are very, as I mentioned, family driven, which means that our credibility is one of the most important assets for us. So we're really trying to make sure that you still trust us, because if we are successful with you, that means we will be successful with your other project or with your suggestion towards someone else to work with us. So yeah, that's how I see it. It's not like a mafia family. It's not like it's not like either you do this, mafia. Yeah, it's not like you do this, and no, it's more of a taking care of each other, because we're very welcoming. If you've ever gone to Mexico, you know that we're very welcoming, and if you need any type of help, we'll make sure you're fine. You've gone there, you know how it feels. So it's kind of like making sure that you trust the other person. It's kind of like changing your mindset and making sure that you understand that it's another country, but the results are going to be the same. Mm-hmm.
What shouldn't you do? Do you have any advice on stuff that you can do that can go totally wrong, or any examples even?
Don't try to make processes as they work here to work in Mexico. Some of them will, but don't try to force things. For example, radio. No, pitching for radio. There are radio stations that won't pick it up. So it's not like saying it. I don't think it happens here, but in the US, they have a very straightforward way of working. I'm sure you've dealt with US promoters in a very straightforward and very clear way. So I think that understanding the market by working with it is the best thing. But what you shouldn't do is trying to change everything. You know what I mean? Like going into a business strategy where you have the guideline of what you want instead of listening to the suggestions of how it should be done. That's for me one of the things that I've noticed with my clients. They come over and they it's really difficult to plug an artist that is not coming to Mexico, but it's very they have to trust us to start seeing the results. And it's not the type of results, for example, in Mexico, and I'm just going very particular on subjects of press, which is what we do. Mexico doesn't have the 60 media music outlets that the US have. We don't have Chicago, New York, Los Angeles. We only have Mexico City for music outlets. So in a US campaign, you're going to have 120 press clippings, but in Mexico, you're going to have 24. But those 24 are the ones that are going to get you booked. So it's a matter of understanding that with media outlets, you're very limited, but with your audience, you're very broad, and you have to create a relationship with the audience. So what you shouldn't do is prioritize media. Also, sorry, I shouldn't have said that because I work in media.
You
It's
shouldn't
true, it's
prioritize
true.
media.
No, the fans are 1st. You have to really connect with your fans, and if you go to Mexico, you should try to make a time to connect with your fans in some kind of way, and not prioritize the media, because it's important, but it's not essential.
Very important. It's very important. You need it in all your campaigns. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, it's very important also because for booking, it's kind of like one of the keys in your press kit to know that Mexico is talking about you.
You say that all the music media outlets is in Mexico City. Why isn't there in any of the other cities?
There are, but they're just not that relevant because of the size of the city, and it's like a very local scene. You have to, if you're a media outlet in Guadalajara trying to speak to the Mexico City audience, it's not gonna resonate the same way, because it's like neighborhoods. We're like divided by neighborhoods, and the way you talk to your neighbor, it's not the same way you will talk to a person that's in a different borough or in a different area, because they don't know what happened yesterday next door, or heard I don't know the fire alarm or whatever. It's that kind of vibe that I think makes the outlets really local in Mexico, and also like the size of it. Just Mexico being so overwhelmingly large compared to the other cities makes it just like the place where an outlet is supposed to be.
And also, some of the outlets are social media driven, and right now the most clicks are coming from reggaeton. So a lot of the bigger outlets like Telehit, which might be our biggest TV station, is moving towards there. And
It's reggaeton.
reggaeton, yes. Yeah, there has been a surge. Like the statistics I showed from 2016 from banda and all the regional music that turned right now, I think it's just overpassed by reggaeton.
If Mexico City is the largest listener base on Spotify, how is that compared to the rest of Mexico? Seeing that many of your cities is like half the size of Sweden, population-wise. Where would the second listener base be, and are they as big?
Either Monterrey or Guadalajara, which are the next biggest cities. In terms of ticket sales, I can tell you that Guadalajara sells 1 ticket for every 3 tickets sold in Mexico City, and Monterrey is like 1 for every 5 tickets sold in Mexico City. So if you play a band, if you're an act that plays to 3,000 people, you should expect like 1,000 people in Monterrey, and close to 600 the other way, 1,000 in Guadalajara and like 600 in Monterrey. So the gap is huge. That's in terms of ticket sales. Streaming would be like similar, I guess.
How would you describe the difference between the independent scene and the mainstream? Is it a
The
huge
mainstream
shift?
is getting so independent lately. Yeah, mainstream right now, and talking about major labels, they're really looking into independent artists because I think we're now having what the UK had in 2009, where Arctic Monkeys and all of those little bands started creating a buzz. It's happening in Mexico. Unfortunately, in Mexico, as in other countries, we don't have a percentage of Spanish-speaking independent music in radio. There's not like a legislation for it to have a percentage. So now with Spotify, but very important, we started having Spotify in 2013. So it was the biggest growth of the company. We used to have it before. It was not legal to have it, but everyone had it. So when it came up and it started being legal, everyone downloaded it. So what's going with that push is that now major labels are looking into independent artists. It's the other way around. Of course, major labels have their big acts and they bring them over and it's always a success. And Billie Eilish just announced two shows after one headline festival. So of course they're gonna have like that part. But right now the major labels are looking into the independent artists. And I think very important, which I haven't mentioned, and I'm really, really sorry, the importance of having a Mexican distributor with the DPS. If you have a Mexican distributor that will distribute your music in the Mexican and Latin American territory, it's easier to monitor what's going on instead of hoping that your major will take care of that. Because then you will have a smaller team of people looking into it in a territorial base, and it's not a matter of choosing to trust a multinational agency to see into that. Yeah, sorry, I missed that. That's very important. I'm sorry.
How have you in the industry, I mean, seeing that, of course, there's been a huge push when the rest of the world noticed how big music is in Mexico City and how many people stream. How have you in the industry noticed that the world's eyes are upon you from
it's
other
terrifying.
music? Yeah, but how do you what's happened?
In my case, there has been a lot of pressure from booking agents selling us international acts, that they come up to us and say, you have to book my artist because they have Mexico City as their number one streaming market. And we always go like, it would be weird if you didn't see Mexico City on your top 5 streaming markets, because it's such a huge sample of the global streaming market. So it took us a little bit to find out what the conversion rate was, which then we noticed it's not proportional. There's no real correlation between streams and ticket sales. You can have an artist that has ridiculous streaming numbers, but they don't actually sell tickets, and that has a lot to do also with how their music is plugged in like editorial playlists in Spotify. Because it means they are getting streams, but they don't really have fans. They're like casual listeners.
What would an example of such an artist be? Who sells no tickets but has loads of listens?
That's a great question. But many like electronic artists, many DJs, they have tons of streams because also they're part of a major label, and they have a lot of power to get into these playlists, but they don't really sell tickets. The only way ticket sales work for electronic artists is on festivals, but they don't sell hard tickets.
What bands would you say are most popular in Mexico right now? You mentioned Kings of Convenience, of course. What others?
Like Scandinavian or
anyone.
Okay, so Billie Eilish, she's huge all over the world. Who else? This is really interesting to me because I think there's an ingredient of what I was mentioning earlier about nostalgia. So Backstreet Boys just sold 60,000 tickets in Mexico in a matter of 3 days, which I think is great because you're starting to see people who grew up with that music, and during that time they had to depend on their parents to get tickets to go see them live, but now they have jobs and they earn their own money, so they can just afford and go to see the acts that they grew up listening with. So I think that's fascinating, and we're really trying to explode that, exploit it. Yeah, it's interesting, and also like obviously rock bands, Guns N' Roses, Pearl Jam, Depeche Mode, Coldplay. Coldplay has been one of the most grossing artists in Mexico in history. That was huge. They played 3 stadiums in 1 year, and that was like a record. Coldplay is huge. U2, all the normal ones.
Okay, let's turn to the audience and see if there's any questions
Cool.
for our Mexican guests.
There's not so much of a playlist culture in Mexico, apart from Spotify. We haven't been able to find, because we're actually in the lookout of editorial, like radio host editorial playlists or media playlists. I just think there are like 2, which big ones. I'm sorry, and big ones. I think it was like 10,000 people subscribed. No, lower than that. It was the Ibero 90.9 playlist, which is kind of like our version of comparing it to a UK station. It might be kind of like XFM, and it just recently started 3 months ago. So, and also for YouTube, we don't have playlists or channels that pick up songs and put them on their own video and then do the playlist. So we do actually have to focus on the playlist that Spotify creates, because we haven't gone into that part. Give us 5 years and maybe we'll get something. But yeah, it's more of a Spotify thing.
There's not a lot of conversation between what breaks in Latin America and then we pick it up in Mexico. I think we pick up more from the US and the UK, like I mentioned, especially for non-Spanish speaking music. I think that's...
In the world I live in, which is mostly independent, export offices for Chile, for Argentina, are doing a great job creating a circuit. So for independent bands that can't afford to do like a tour, the export offices are actually doing a great job trying to create a network within where they help each other. I think Mexico has become a highlighter for bands to tour Latin America, definitely. Like, if you go, but it's easier. I think this will clear up a little bit more. It's easier to tour the US and drive to Mexico than do Latin America and drive up. So I think that's how it settled. And that has obviously permeated into the music business, the way it goes from up to down instead of down to up. But Mexico is a very important gateway and bridge towards Latin America. No, it's a common mistake to choose the first booker you talk to, because it is very common to, unfortunately, because of not asking around and understanding the type of people that you're working with, to unfortunately choose the wrong one. There's no legislation also in Mexico that if you're a booker, you can't be a manager. So you can be everything in Mexico. So yeah.
I would really suggest that, as Malfi mentioned earlier, that you do ask your peers, even if they're not necessarily Sweden, but maybe a Norwegian band that went to Mexico, and ask them how their experience was, because it's important to trust. But the truth is, there really are like some flaky and dodgy promoters in Mexico that will not pay you. So Like you have to be
Sorry.
careful.
It just popped into on, but I think that I think a red flag would be if they accept your first offer. Like if you give them the money and you give them the fee and they automatically say yes.
No, but it's the other way around.
Yeah, sorry, yeah, the other way around, yeah.
The promoter would make an offer for the artist, right? And sometimes if it's a promoter that you have no experience with and nobody else knows, I would like literally ask for the money up front and have them pay you before you make the trip. There's not a lot of like independent promoters who will do that, but at least you won't take chances, you know.
And also, if you get approached by someone who doesn't do that, you can also look for credentials. So if they're doing like Normal Festival, which is one of the biggest independent festivals in Mexico, if you've seen that the lineup has been consistent for the last 10 years, you can trust them. No, but if you notice that you were approached by a booker that only has 5 or 6 shows in their Facebook, I wouldn't go there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Consistency is key. Yeah.
There's a lot of audience for it, actually. I remember, which was the band that sold out Aural, that everyone was really excited about? Well, there was Spiritualized, and there was another one after the earthquake. Well, I'll pick it up. But yeah, there's Explosions in the Sky also do really well in Mexico.
Krungbin.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, there's an audience for it. You just have to find it. And it has to do a lot, obviously, it has to do a lot with your own credibility on your band and the credibility on the project and the credibility that people here have made it have. You have to trust that your project is good enough for the audience. But yeah, it's well received, and that it may not have a lot of media, but there's a lot of audience, especially because being a Swedish band, you might probably sing in Swedish.
Most often, not.
Not really. What's your percentage of English speaking?
Percentage? Looking nervously at someone else? Jeppe. What? 80-20.
Oh, okay.
With the 20 being Swedish.
80 being Swedish?
80
yes.
being English, yeah.
Yeah. No, so there wouldn't be a problem then.
I encourage you to keep that percentage the way it is, or even increase it, because it's gonna be really hard to penetrate a market like Mexico, like singing in Swedish.
Yeah, but what I meant is that being a Swedish artist that has instrumental music might be a little bit easier than entering as a Swedish artist singing in Swedish.
Yes, I think that would be very hard. How is, many Swedish metal bands and punk bands often come to Mexico. There's a lot of local promoters for those genres. How are those genres, general or more extremer genres, such as black metal, grindcore, crust punk? How are they viewed generally in the industry?
Mexico City is open to that genre. There's also like 3 or 4 festivals that would book those sort of bands. But then there's the other extreme, which is a city like Monterrey, which banned death metal concerts, and they have
Why?
canceled because of the political
Conservative, no?
the conservative and the religious point of view of the society in that market. So I mean, you will have a difficult time with cities that are not as open-minded as Mexico City, but there is a market. So I would go to Mexico City, and especially if you're a band that's in the developing stages, the festival is the best format that you can aim for.
And I also love these stories about metal festivals and punk festivals having the most cleanest crowds.
Yeah.
That's a really nice story. You should tell that.
Yeah, so first we did our first metal festival not so long ago. It was like 3 years ago, and we noticed that the audience, like the people who deal with security and who deal with the venue operations of the festival were really really nervous that there was gonna be like decapitations and like crazy sacrifices, goats, happening. And the truth was that they were surprised because they were the most calm, civilized, polite people, friendly people,
family oriented.
Yeah, it was crazy, and you would not see a cup, like a plastic cup on the grounds. They would all like throw it in the bins, garbage bins. They will go with their kids. It was a really really special time, and that's when we noticed, wow, this audience is like really really civilized and educated. So we just kept doing the festival, and everyone's happy now.
Looking at, if I throw the question back to you, looking at Mexican music, what is the percentage of people singing in English?
Like 5%?
10 or 5.
10? That's still a bit. That's still pretty much.
But they're not successful though.
Everyone mocks them and goes, "Why are you singing in English?"
Yeah, they're judged.
And they all answer Phoenix, and I'm just like, stop answering that. It's no longer. Yeah, it's yeah.
Phoenix?
Yeah,
The band Phoenix.
Yeah. Oh no, but it's only 10% that sing in English. Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a joke. It's kind of like a joke if you do it for everyone.
Yeah, I don't know. It doesn't seem natural, and you would just alienate your Mexican audience if you did that.
Yeah.
So it's true. But then there's also, like, right now there's a boom, especially in the Latin US market. The United States has a huge Mexican population and a huge Latin population, which is great for Spanish-speaking artists. They're exporting the music to the US, and they're doing really well. So I think also with the reggaeton phenomenon and Rosalia, people are, especially in markets that don't necessarily speak Spanish. Rosalia, yeah, the Spanish singer, you know her? Well, she's huge in Mexico and in the US right now.
Does everyone know her?
Do you? Oh. Yeah, she's a great example of music gentrification.
And that's opening a lot of doors for Spanish-speaking music, I think.
You're working with large festivals, and how would you say the festival market has exploded, as you said before? How do you think when booking festivals?
How do we think? Well, we recently opened our eyes and saw that there's very, very few female artists in our lineups. So right now we're working towards balancing the scale and having more female artists. And beyond that, we try to have every festival have its own personality and have a very, very precise booking and curation, so that they feel different, not only in the experience but also in like the lineup and how it's perceived outside. So we always think about, does this artist fit the lineup, or are we just throwing it because an agent is asking us to, like, asking for a favor, or we get a lot of pressure from agents and labels to put some artists in lineups that sometimes don't really make sense. So we try to stay as loyal as possible to the festival personality and the festival's essence, because it's always catered to a very specific audience. If you go too broad, you're gonna lose. It's not like 1 + 1 + 1 and you're gonna have 3 people coming to the festival. It has to make sense as a whole, and that's the way it's appealing for the audience.
What's happening a lot in Mexico is that the festivals are having their own type of audience, which means that they get to sell a lot of the tickets before the lineup is announced. So if you follow a certain genre, you may just focus on Normal or on Ceremonia or on Corona Capital. I know that I'll go to Corona forever and ever. I don't care about the lineup. I just want to have a good time in the festival. So that's a lot of what's going on in Mexico. And we have boutique festivals, which a lot of tourists come to, which is Baidora, which is Tropico. Ceremonia also gets a lot of that. And it's actually cheaper to come over to Mexico with a great lineup and have a couple of nights in Mexico instead of going to Austin City Limits or outside lands. So the good thing is that festivals right now are creating their own language and are getting to sell tickets before the lineup is announced. So I think that's pretty great. Also for promoters because they also know how to direct the artists. For bookers to know how to address the artists they're pitching.
How is the age groups? What age groups are going to the festivals? Is it mainly young people, or is it
Depends
spread,
on the
spread
festival.
across? Of course, but
Yes.
is it mainly also spread across the age groups?
It's pretty wide. I'd say from 15 to 45 and 50 years old. So it's wide, but each festival you will see very clearly who it's aimed towards. You will see that EDC is super young teens, and you would rarely see an adult in those festivals. And we've also tried. We have a couple of projects that are festivals aimed really towards oldies and the music. I mean it's a completely different experience. You have to focus on different things to make it attractive for them to go to festivals, because sometimes older people will say, I'm too old for going to a festival because I don't want to deal with crowds, I don't want to deal with the sun, I don't want to deal with a lot of things. So you have to think about that beforehand and try to make the experience as attractive to them as possible. So, but it's wide. It will spread out between many different types of ages.
I have a question about the Funky Holes, which is a great title for a legal rock show.
Oye Funky.
Oye Funky in
Oye,
Spanish.
where's your funky hole? No, but was I the only one thinking of that?
I
Yeah,
think so.
that's right.
Wait, how
It's
does that-
funny.
Does that culture of these illegal clubs, does that live on in some way in Mexico?
It doesn't. But we live in a second, a 2.0 version of it. It feels really. It feels as if I'm continuing my dad's work. My dad was involved in Hoyos Funky, and my dad actually was part of the creation of El Tri, Three Souls in My Mind, which was one of the biggest rock bands in Mexico now, which was originated in those. So they had a transcendence. So unfortunately, so it feels as if I'm continuing his work and legitimizing what he started. But right now, it's so difficult to have a show in Mexico without security, without the caution of the audience. As I mentioned, it's not unsafe, but you don't want to deal with the wrong people in your venues. You want to make sure that the permits are there, because it's really easy to close a venue in Mexico. We just lived through Caradura's. It was closed for 3 days. And those 3-day closure had to push a complete month of shows. So you have to be really careful, because you have to deal with international relationships and flights that were already booked. And so right now we have to take care of security a lot. And there are bad crowds in Mexico, as there are everywhere. So you want to make sure that everything's taken care of. And if we already lost the credibility of our shows because of mayhem, we don't want to do it again.
I think that's a positive thing, though, because it makes you. If you're a club owner or a venue owner, you don't want to deal with insurance stuff. We have earthquakes in Mexico, so you can put people in really dangerous situations if you don't have your fire department protocols in order, if you don't have all your paperwork, your social liability insurance. That's a very important thing to keep in mind, because if Funky Holes were still around and you have an earthquake, that would be so dangerous to have happen.
I think the last problem we had with audiences and not making sure we have security was 12 years ago with Lobombo, which is a dance venue, and that was the last one.
Would you say that there's still like the old history of music being banned and large events being banned? Is it still like some sort of dark cloud that might happen? I mean, do people from the government, do you feel that they have eyes on the music industry to make?
Well, they have eyes. They have
How does
eyes.
it affect how you work?
No, it's a good thing because Zocalo, for example, with Roger Waters and Justin Bieber. So I think
Yeah,
it should
no,
take
okay, so I think since it's now like super regulated by the government, and since they see so much money come in from that business, that they're willing to cooperate and find a way to make it work. Withholding percentages, like tax withholding percentages for international artists in Mexico is 25%. So imagine how many millions of dollars go into the government because of shows. It's a lot of money. So that has really opened their eyes, but in the economic sense, and they're really happy because that's a lot of money. And also, we've collaborated with the government to have public appearances of like Roger Waters at the main square plaza in Mexico City, which fits 150,000 people
for free.
for free.
With the wall? Or
Yeah.
With all the
Yes.
images?
I don't think they understood what was going on, but it was like very political, and everyone was like, "Fuck yeah!"
And it was just when Trump was going on the presidency. So it was
very
it was a great show.
anti-Trump
They
concert.
didn't know what they were saying yes to.
Yeah, exactly. But the people were happy, you know.
Instagram and then Facebook and then YouTube.
But depends on your target audience.
Yeah, actually.
Like if you have a rock band, maybe Facebook is the right way. If it's a pop project or an electronic project, then probably Instagram. Because it depends on who you're trying to speak to.
Yeah, that's the kind of like the order of consumption in Mexico.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much,
Thank you,
Malfi
Ika.
and Ricardo. And
Thank you.
please come and talk to them afterwards.